Excuse me, everyone, may I have your attention? Good morning and welcome to today's Federalist Society debate. While I introduce our speakers, I'm going to have Professor Blackman sign the lucky winner's copy
Whoa, who gets it?
of Intro to Common Law.
Who gets it?
I'm teaching common law next semester, so I need it.
Oh. I'd be happy to give you a copy.
Here, would you
Well, who do I sign it to, though? That's the key question. Inscribe it, don't I?
guys like a personal inscribing?
Yes.
All right, my bad.
True story. True story. Someone once bought one of my books on Amazon, and it was already signed. Why? I had signed it at a book signing, and they didn't realize it. They sent it back to the publisher. So Amazon sold the book with my signature. That's kind of cool.
So today's debate is the Constitution versus culture. What really governs our society? Some people say that the Declaration of Independence gave rise to our written Constitution, and that the Constitution, as we know it today, makes the rules and body of standards for today's country. Others of the school of Joseph DeMais say that written constitutions aren't really that important. What actually governs is we the people. That people, cultures, customs, traditions, that's what makes up a body of law. That's what makes up a country. Today we have Professor Josh Blackman. Professor Blackman is an esteemed constitutional scholar and revered nationwide.
Revered, oh boy. Tolerated, maybe.
I may have a sanctuary of you in my room.
Oh boy. Any candles? Any?
He has co-authored a book with Professor Randy Barnett. Professor Randy Barnett and Professor Blackman created this wonderful introduction to constitutional law with a wonderful case line and video lecture series. Again, I was going to take it for myself when it was given to me by FedSoc National, but I said, you know, the 1Ls needed more, so we'll give it to them. Then we have our esteemed Professor Joseph D'Agostino, who comes from wonderful Virginia. Not DC, wonderful Virginia. DC is a swamp, as Professor Blackman can attest to.
It's a swamp.
Professor D'Agostino is a wonderful traditional Catholic and esteemed constitutional scholar in his own respect. We're going to first have 10 minutes for Professor Blackman and then 10 minutes for Professor D'Agostino.
All right, thank
Professor
you so
Blackman,
much.
you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So, happy birthday, everyone. This year is the 250th anniversary of our Declaration, and it's a very momentous moment. Now, who's taken common law so far?
Next semester.
Oh, you haven't taken yet. Beautiful. Crash course. So, the Constitution was drafted in 1787 and approved in 1788, and the first Congress met in 1789. But before the Constitution, we had an earlier government. Everyone knows July 4th, right? We have fireworks, we hot dogs. But we celebrate that day for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was a legal document. It was drafted by a bunch of lawyers, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and others. And at its heart, it was stating a legal principle. The colonies would no longer be under the rule of the king. It was basically a breach, right? Here are the terms of civil society. You must protect us. You must give us representation. You must secure our rights. And because you've breached those duties, we're exiting. And you always speak of what's the remedy for a breach? Well, it's called war. Now, we call it the Revolutionary War. Our friends in England call it the Civil War. They thought there was just an uprising, a rebellion among the colonists. But the colonists knew well that our goal was something different. It was to form a new nation, one conceived in liberty, one might say. Again, so the Declaration was signed in 1776. A few years later, we have the first form of government, the Articles of Confederation. This was an early attempt at making a government for this new nation. And it didn't work. There were things that were wrong with it. But it doesn't mean we don't study it. So my very brief time today, I want to focus on some aspects of the Declaration that directly affected our Constitution. I don't think you understand the Constitution without understanding the Declaration. Now, they're not the same. There's differences. But I think there are similarities. So let's start first with the powers of Congress, right? I'm sure you've all seen the phrase, no taxation without representation, right? You've seen that bumper sticker somewhere. Much of what Article 1 of the Constitution is about is about representation. Why? In the colonial era, our forefathers did not have representation. So we have election clauses. Okay, that's number one. There are actually about 20 of these, so that's number one. Number two, how does a bill become a law? You've all seen the Schoolhouse Rock show, right? It goes from one house of Congress, goes to the other house of Congress, and it's signed by the president. But what's not known is that during the colonial era, the state legislatures in the colonies could not make laws. The king actually suspended the power to make laws. The king could veto any laws that were passed by the colonies. So in our Constitution, we enshrine this process, a two-step process where the legislature makes the laws, the president can veto it, but the veto can be overrun. What about immigration? We think a lot about immigration today, but at the time of the framing of the Constitution, we had a pretty empty country, right? There weren't many people here. And the colonists wanted to incentivize people to come to the United States. The king wouldn't let them. He barred naturalization in the colonies. So our Constitution gives specifically the power of naturalization to Congress. That's number three. What about war? It was well known that the King of England got Britain into many long, bloody, and deadly wars. Often they didn't make much sense. The king was both a commander-in-chief and also the power to declare war. Not so, our framers realized. Here, the power of declaring war was vested not in the president, but in the Congress. Number five, the issue of slavery came up, but not in the most obvious way. An earlier draft of the Declaration called slavery a cruel war against nature itself. Jefferson was a bit of a contrast. Even though he held slaves, he realized this was an evil. And at least in 1776, he hoped this institution would come to an end, would take a bloody civil war to accomplish that. But the Constitution at least countenanced slavery, didn't approve it, but it recognized its existence for a limited time. Specifically, the importation of slaves would exist at least until 1808, and indeed in 1808 the slave trade was abolished. Treaties. How do nations in the world deal with each other? They form treaties. But one of the facets of having this new republic was that you need to have a centralized government. Congress could make treaties. The states could not. All right. So those are the powers of Congress. Come on in. So next we turn to the executive branch. One of the biggest abuses of the crown was the appointment of officers. These are people who would inspect homes, collect taxes, and harass the people. Under our Constitution, does the executive get to appoint officers by himself? Generally, no. For principal officers, the primary officers, we must go through a specific process where the president nominates and the Senate consents. For the inferior officers, perhaps the president can appoint alone, but that is up to the Congress. What about adjournment? This may not seem obvious. Right now, the House is in recess because there's a shutdown. Who gets to decide when the House adjourns? The House. The king, though, had the power to tell the Parliament, you go home, you are dissolved. The king could just dissolve the Parliament. So the king could frustrate the legislative power. Not so in our Constitution. Under our Constitution, this is clause number 8, Congress decides when to adjourn. Only in very rare cases of disagreement can the president step in for a limited purpose. Okay, let's go to Article 3 and the courts, the judiciary. In England, the judges served to the king's pleasure. So if a judge wrote a ruling the king didn't like, you're fired. Fired. Our framers recognized that was a dangerous model. The judges in our federal system have what's called good behavior tenure. So long as they behave well, whatever that means, they get to keep their jobs. Likewise, if you were a judge in England, your compensation was set by the king. If you issued some rulings he likes, he could increase your salary. If you issued some rulings he didn't like, he could decrease your salary. Not so. Under our Constitution, judicial compensation is fixed. It can be increased, no guarantee, but it cannot be decreased. By the way, there's no inflation adjustment for federal judges. That's up to Congress to fix. The 11th provision concerns trials, trial by jury. The trial by jury was seen as the most pivotal right in a republic because it was a check on the criminal abuses of the crown. Under a constitution, you always have the right to a jury in a criminal case. This is a bedrock principle. Okay, that's 11. Number 12, treason, right? What's treason? Treason in the abstract is some sort of serious offense against the state, maybe trying to overrule the state, giving aid and comfort to enemies. But it was very common in England. The king could just declare anyone, he's a traitor. He's a traitor, off with their head, right? Alice in Wonderland. Not so in our system. The Constitution says specifically, here is what treason is: leaving war against the United States, adhering to the enemies of the United States, giving aid and comfort to our enemies. And you can't be convicted of treason unless you're in open court with 2 witnesses. There's actually an evidentiary standard in the Constitution. People don't quite appreciate this. Okay, that's 12. Number 13, oaths. Everyone who works for the government takes an oath to the Constitution. Not an oath to the king, not an oath to any particular figure, to the Constitution itself. And this was a very important innovation in the law. Our supreme law was not the crown, whoever happened to wear it at a given time. It was the Constitution. Without the supremacy clause, our Constitution would not work. Everything would fall apart. It's what keeps our entire republic together. Let's move on now to the Bill of Rights. People don't remember this, but the Constitution, again, was 1787, approved in 1788. Congress meets in 1789. One of the first things Congress does when they meet is they propose amendments to the Constitution. And we all know there were 10 amendments. There actually were 12 proposed amendments. The first 2 were not adopted, at least one of them not right away. So the first amendment, people know about free speech and free religion, but there's something called the Petition Clause. Back in the day, how did you complain to the king? You would submit a formal petition. Our Constitution secures the right to petition. The Declaration of Independence was a petition. It's like, King George, we submit to you in the humblest terms. Please hear our cries. And if you don't, we will say farewell. The Third Amendment, everyone's favorite amendment, the Third Amendment, was quartering of troops. This was a big deal. Today we don't care about it. This was a very big deal. During the colonial era, it was very common for the king and his agents to station troops in your home. You did not have a choice to say no. And while this troop was in your house, maybe he'd be a very nice person, but also he could be a jerk. Maybe he'd spy on you, say, they're engaging in some unpatriotic activities. They are smuggling tea. They are playing cards without the appropriate tax stamps. So the Third Amendment prohibits this. We've talked about the jury trial, but let's talk about the grand jury. What's a grand jury? Grand jury, a big jury. This is what chooses to bring criminal charges. If the government wants to prosecute you, they must convince a group of your peers that this charge is valid. It doesn't mean you're guilty, but the case can go forward. Our Fifth Amendment guarantees a right of grand jury indictment. Number 17, the vicinage clause. You never heard of this one. Where are you going to be tried? It was very common for people to be charged with crimes in the Americas and sent to England to be tried. Not so. Under the vicinage clause, you are tried in your community with your peers. That way the people who know you can decide whether you are guilty. Then we go to the jury trial in the civil context. Our Constitution guarantees a right to a civil jury. It amounts more than $20, kind of a funny amount, but that's what it says in the Constitution. This ensures that even in civil matters, your judgment of your peers will stand. All right, so let's jump ahead with 2 more amendments. In 1865, after a bloody civil war, Congress passes the 13th Amendment. This abolishes slavery. And in many regards, the 13th Amendment gave fruit to the Declaration. It speaks of all men being created equal. That wasn't exactly the case in the law at the time. But the 13th Amendment established slavery shall not exist in the United States, period. This was giving fulfillment to Jefferson's promise. See, when you write something in the Declaration, it's something you can hold up to. And then we pursued it. And then 3 years later, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, and this law said we cannot deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. Now, Then we think of the Equal Protection Clause saying, okay, we have to treat people of different races alike. And that's true. But what does protection mean? Protection means protection from violence. The king was not protecting his people. He letting them subject to be attacked by foreigners. Protection meant much the same in the 1860s. This wasn't just about treating people equally. It was about stopping the Klan, stopping lynch mobs. Very often, the people in uniform, the police, the government, were not stopping these acts of violence because they agreed with them. So our Constitution secured this right of protection against violence. All right, I think we're right at time. I will stop now. I welcome your questions later. Mr. D'Agostino, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you, Professor Blackman. Really appreciate it. I think most of that was new to these students, absolutely, to most of them. I want to try to outline a very different way of thinking about the world, politics, constitutional law, really kind of human nature, okay, to a considerable extent, right? It's a different way of thinking about this, right? So there's a lot of talk about the importance of what the Declaration said, what the Constitution said, right? And the various provisions in them, right? My belief is the written provisions of things like constitutions don't typically matter very much, except as they codify and exhort, right? They're kind of a rhetoric, they're encouraging, right? They provide guidelines, right? They exhort people to do this or do that, right? As a form of rhetoric, form of persuasion, right? Or they codify pre-existing realities or realities that were already coming into being as opposed to actually changing things on the ground, right? And they also don't really resist changes on the ground very well, right? So Professor Blackman and I aren't not, at least so far, we're not clashing too much exactly, right? But it's basically sort of Professor Blackman's view of things versus sort of my general view of things to some extent differs, right? So I believe that what really matters, what are the most fundamental things in the life of a polity, whether it's a nation or whether it's a city or the life of a person, are spiritual and material forces, not what today we would call reason, right? Rational arguments. I don't think rational arguments are really the primary mover of politics, the primary mover of constitutional design, the primary mover of people's lives, right? I just don't think human beings work that way the vast majority of the time. This is not to say that reason isn't real or reason's just sort of an epiphenomenon that's built upon irrational forces. That's not what I'm saying, right? Reason is real. Reason does have an effect. It's just not the most important effect, right? So basically, my idea is a counter-enlightenment idea, right? It's not my ideas. It's ideas that I've adopted from much wiser and cleverer men than myself who've written in the past, right? And so my idea is, and what I want to do, you know, as a professor and as a scholar, is recover and sort of promote the counter-enlightenment ideas of human nature, of politics, and of constitutions, right? So we have the Enlightenment ideas of we, you know, rationally design a constitution, we rationally design the law, like we think rationally, what are our goals, then we're gonna rationally pursue our goals, we're gonna implement our goals through things like a constitution, and this is gonna work out. It's not gonna work out perfectly, right? But it's gonna more or less work out well if we do it properly. And I just don't think the world works this way, right? And so the things in the Declaration that are more abstract, things like the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those things that are more abstract, well, they play out in ways that it's going to fit the people who play them out, as opposed to some abstract idea of what these things are, okay? So the character of the rulers of a society, right, and the ruled of a society, that is the ordinary people, right? The character of the rulers, the people who are in charge, versus the people, the ruled, right? That is what determines what happens. Their character, their spirituality, their beliefs, their culture, their race, their religion, right? And I don't think what the written constitutions or provisions say really stand in the way of that or of their development. The forces that move through the world push things along and make things happen regardless of really so much rational resistance or so many sort of rational designs or schemes, right? So to some extent, my touchstone is Joseph de Maistre. He was a counter-revolutionary author, died in 1821. He was not French, but most people think he was. He was actually Savoyard, but he wrote in French, and he wrote against the French Revolution, right? He very much critiqued the French Revolution. And he critiqued it in a way that is more accessible to people today than a lot of critiques of the French Revolution, of the Enlightenment, because he himself had some Enlightenment-ish ideas. He was actually a Freemason before the French Revolution began. He initially supported the reforms of the French Revolution, very quickly was disillusioned by the course the French Revolution took, right? Very bloody, very radical, very murderous, ended up in the military dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte, right, who conquered most of Europe before finally being defeated. So Maistre had a very different view. He was sort of like the Edmund Burke in French, right? If you're familiar with Edmund Burke, he wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he wrote against the French Revolution, despite being kind of liberal for his day, for a British member of parliament in his day. He supported the Americans, for example, us Americans, Edmund Burke did, but he didn't like the French revolutionaries, and he wrote a famous book and very much denounced the French Revolution and predicted where it would go, and he was very accurate in seeing where the bloody course that it would take, right? And so Maistre was somewhat like that, but writing in French, right? So one of the things Maistre says, right, in one of his, maybe his most famous book, it's really a long essay, like 70 pages, The Generative Principle of Political Constitutions, right? He says, well, what really moves societies, what makes these things happen? Spiritual forces, historical forces, material and economic forces. This is really what's driving things, right? And he says about the French Revolution, like if you look at the history of the French Revolution, men did not drive the revolution. The revolution drove men, okay? It had a life of its own. It had forces. It had a force of its own. It was like a spiritual force coming from outside that pushed people along, and it rolled like a juggernaut over the very people who promoted the French Revolution. So many of the men who promoted the French Revolution, they got their own heads chopped off. Robespierre most famously, but many others. It rolled along of its own force and of its own accord. And I think if you look at your life, you will see that too. You look at your life as pushed forward, guided by these forces that can be very difficult to understand, and they're not rational, or at least not rational to the modern understanding of them, right? So Freudianism made great work of this, right, to say, oh, this subconscious things, this is really driving your life, and to some extent, that's true, right? I think that's very, very true. Okay, well, what about the American? Well, the American Revolution, it wasn't like the French Revolution, right? We fought what was considered at the time a fairly dignified war, at least by today's standards, and there wasn't this big social revolution, et cetera. Well, you know what? John Adams and other founding fathers said the same thing. So John Adams wrote in 1780, right? John Adams, one of the main founding fathers, first vice president of the United States, second president of the United States, he wrote, the revolution was conducted by providence, right, by God. The American Revolution was carried forward by providence. We were just his instruments if we were just lucky. Our job is just to conform to the force that comes outside of us. It wasn't us men making the decisions, making the revolution happen, creating this great new country. We were merely assistants in a project that was much bigger and came outside of ourselves, right? And he didn't write this in some sort of flowery public speech to try to win office. He wrote this in a letter to a friend, okay? And so that's the perspective many of the founding fathers had, including John Adams, one of the most famous ones, right? It's not, okay, we're sitting around here, we're thinking about things, right? The Constitution is a great example, right? The Constitution has all these written provisions in it that today simply are ignored or obviously subverted, right? Some are followed, some are not. Why? What makes the difference? It's obviously not what's written on the page that makes the difference. What's written on the parchment that makes the difference. It's the interests and belief of the people in charge. It's what the ordinary people will tolerate, right? That's why, right? The Interstate Commerce Clause has been expanded to include almost anything, right? Federalism has been shrunk to include very little, especially when you consider the federal government uses its spending power, right? It dangles money in front of the states, right? It taxes the people of the states, dangles money in front of the state government, says, you get this money, but only if you do what we tell you. The Supreme Court has, by and large, upheld that kind of, what you could say, coercive effect that basically, as a matter of reality, destroys federalism, right? As for the separation of powers, you're going to hear all about that in con law class, the separation of powers, right? Well, many of you probably already know the administrative state does most things. The executive branch and independent agencies do most things. They pass the laws, they investigate violations of the laws, they enforce the laws, and they administer punishments for violation of the law, right? The executive branch, understood broadly, does it all, right? Congress doesn't do that much anymore. Congress is, except spend money, lots and lots of money, right? Congress doesn't do that much outside of that anymore. It's delegated. You heard the non-delegation doctrine. So what about the non-delegation doctrine? It's almost dead, right? Congress has delegated its authority to executive branch agencies. The judiciary has taken over most of the other aspects of governance of this country, right? We all wait for these Supreme Court decisions that are going to tell us what we can do, right? Is that because the Constitution's text has changed, right? Or the law has changed? Usually not. It's because the personnel on the court has changed, right? And they have different views and they interpret things differently. It's not what the written words say, right? So I think what we want to do is we want to look at like what really matters, right? So we're going to read the Constitution. We see all these different provisions, right? Some of them are followed, some of them are clearly not followed, some are followed in very disingenuous ways. It's not what it says, right? That really matters. It's other things. It's the interests of the people in charge. It's the interests of the ordinary people or what they're willing to tolerate. It's what people believe about human life. It's where the money goes, how the money influences things, right? So even when it comes to the American Revolution, one thing Professor Blackman didn't mention is one of the major drivers behind that was the desire to move west, right? The British government had made a deal with the French and some of the Indian tribes to prevent the American colonists from moving further west, right? And many of the American colonists from George Washington on down wanted that land out west. They didn't want the French to have it. They didn't want the Indians to have it. They wanted it for themselves, right? And so to conclude the French and Indian War and try to keep the peace, the British government had made that deal and the American colonists didn't like it. They wanted the land, right? And that's one of the reasons, right, behind the French Revolution. A very simple, straightforward, they have the land, our government's preventing us from getting the land, we're going to leave our government, have a new government, and then go take the land, which is exactly what happens, right? Exactly what happens. This doesn't mean some people weren't genuinely motivated by desire for liberty. They absolutely were, right? Some American colonists were motivated by the desire for just independence. They just don't want someone on the other side of the ocean telling them what to do, right? No matter what they're telling them, right? Absolutely true. But there are these other forces at work. And so, you know, a good example is, I think Professor Blackman mentioned that the monarchs of England can veto acts of parliament. Well, that's still true today, right? But the last monarch of Britain who vetoed an act of parliament was Queen Anne in the 18th century. To this day, King Charles could veto any act of parliament he wants, right? That's how it works. No one disputes that. Every bill, when it's passed by Parliament, must obtain what they call royal assent before it can be enacted into law and implemented, okay? But why has it been in over 200 years, no monarch has done that, exercised this very important power, right? Did the law change? Anything written change? No. The culture changed to which monarchs can't get away with that, right? Britain is technically a monarchy, but the fact is the monarchs have very limited power. They can't get away with it, right? So that's an example where the Constitution of Britain perfectly supports the idea of monarchs vetoing legislation, acts of parliament. But it's a reality that doesn't exist. And the reality is much more important than what the law says, right? So this is just sort of a basic introduction to the idea of what I'm talking about, counter-enlightenment idea, spiritual realities, people's religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, economic realities, material forces. This is what determines things much more than reason, rational debates that are designing things for liberty. And when we look at those things, we can see why some written provisions of things like constitutions actually are followed and others are not. And usually the answer is not some sort of rational argument. So hopefully we can continue, yeah.
So I love written constitutions. I keep one in my breast pocket right next to my heart all the time. So I value it. And I think there's some areas where we agree and some areas we disagree. So I'm sure you've learned about learned hand, right? Learned hand, or the hand formula. And learned hand once said, liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do very much to help it. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which is not too sure that is right. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. And I think that in a certain way gets at what Professor D'Agostino was talking about, right? This document in my pocket, it's just a piece of paper, right? These are what we call parchment barriers. And unless you have some cultural, spiritual, political force behind it, this is worthless. Justice Scalia would often say that his favorite constitution in the world was the Constitution of the Soviet Union. You want to read the Soviet Union Constitution? It's a lovely document. Guarantees rights to food and to housing and to speech and to religion. It's got this entire beautiful guarantees of rights. It was also worthless, right? They never protected those rights. It was just paper. It was just parchment. Justice Scalia understood, and I think a lot of the framers understood as well, what protects us is not paper. It's human nature. And specifically, as Madison said in the Federalist Papers, we're all ambitious, right? I'm ambitious, he's ambitious, you're ambitious. We all have our own ambitions. We want to accomplish certain things. The genius of our Constitution was it didn't give any one person all that power. It separated the power out so ambition, as Madison said, could counteract ambition. That we can butt heads against each other, and from that struggle, the best policy will endure. And I think what our Constitution does that's so brilliant, and I do love our Constitution very deeply, is it sets up the structure of this government which has succeeded to this day. Now, I agree, the Commerce Clause has been bastardized, right? Federalism is largely dead. I'm with him on every one of those points. That's a problem. And I would favor appointing judges who could bring back the original meaning of the Commerce Clause, like Justice Thomas and others. We'll keep working on it. But until we get there, this is the longest surviving constitution in the world. Actually, the Massachusetts Constitution is a little bit older, but we'll just go along with it for now. And let's look at a contrast. We had a revolution around the same time France did, right? Why is it that our revolution turned out so much better than theirs? We didn't have the guillotine. We didn't have the reign of terror. We had George Washington and not a Napoleon. Why? So Providence, I actually profoundly agree. God was shining on our side, no doubt about that. There's no other way to explain it. John Adams was a very wise observer. But also I would give some credit to the theories that Professor D'Agostino rejects, which is the Enlightenment, right? There was a generally understood acceptance among the framers of reason, that there was this law that existed. The natural law of the Declaration, they were appealing to a higher power, call it whatever you wish. And it was these forces, I think, that led us on the path to prosperity and led France on the path to the guillotine, which is not a pleasant way to die. So as we celebrate our 250th birthday this coming year, celebrate the Constitution, celebrate the Declaration, and pray that this document will get us for another 250 years, and maybe we'll celebrate America 500 at some point. Thank you so much.
So, let's see. Where do I disagree with Professor Blackman? We might disagree on originalism, okay? I used to be an originalist. I'm not anymore, okay? Why don't I want to bring back the original meaning of the Constitution? I just don't think it's feasible, right? America, leftist critiquers of the Constitution are correct. America's a very different country. What worked in 1789 is just not going to work today, right? I don't believe we can shrink the federal government to the size as originally envisioned by the Founding Fathers. In an abstract way, I would much prefer that. That is my kind of idea of a better government. A more ideal government would be the government of 1789. Let's take that, add the Bill of Rights and the 13th Amendment, and we'll be great, But in America today, it can't work, right? It can't work because the people of America are very different from the people of America at the time. The culture is very different, the spirituality is very different, and technology is very different. Let's take some simple things. Criminals today can easily get from one state to the other very quickly. We need federal involvement in pursuing criminals back in the day when only local or maybe state authorities were needed to pursue criminals, right? We can't really go back to the kind of very small government that we used to have, right? You maybe remember a few years ago the defund the police movement, abolish the police movement. You know, that was not a crazy left-wing utopian idea, okay? Needless to say, leftists have some very crazy utopian ideas that will never work, right? But there have been societies, including in the United States, including in England and other places in the world, for centuries where there were no professional police forces. They were not needed, right? So what, the defund the police, abolish the police, there's actually historical precedent for that. Entire societies for centuries with no professional police, no one patrolling around on behalf of the, paid by and behalf of the government, seeing if anyone's breaking the law, right? Could America today survive without police forces? I don't think so, right? Things have radically changed, right? At the time of the revolution in colonial Massachusetts, there were 6 full-time employees of the colonial government. 6, imagine 6 full-time employees of a state government, right? Even with a population of the size of colonial Massachusetts. It's just unthinkable today, right? It just couldn't work, right? So those are just some examples, right? Even Justice Scalia, who I'm sure Professor Blackman admires to a considerable extent, as I do, called himself a faint-hearted originalist. He was an originalist except when he wasn't, right? Why? Because real consistent originalism can't work, right? And that's just the unfortunate reality. And so I believe in kind of accepting the realities, you know. And some people can see the realities before other people can. I have a great example. Gouverneur Morris, he was ambassador to France on behalf of the United States when the French Revolution was getting underway. And people there were very idealistic. They were saying, we're going to have a revolution like yours. You know, we're going to have, we're going to have a great, we'll have a constitutional monarchy like Britain. We're going to have all kind of rights, right? We're going to get rid of the absolute monarchy we have now, so on and so forth. And it's going to be great. We're going to do what you guys did. And Governor Morris said, no, you won't. It will be a disaster here. You can't do what we did because you don't have the character of the American people. The French character, the character of the French people cannot support a revolution of the type that we had in America, right? It won't work, right? And of course, he was correct, right? Just not capable. And according to him and people like him, it wasn't because some people made some wrong decisions. It was very much against the character of the French nation to be able to conduct the kind of revolution that the American nation, the American colonists, were capable of conducting, because they're very different culture, they're very different history, they're very different religion. A big aspect of the American Revolution and its success was the Calvinist nature of a lot of the leading lights of the revolution, the Calvinist theology, right? I'm not a Calvinist, I don't like a lot of Calvinist theology, but it did play a major role in the revolution and how it moved forward, this kind of Protestant theology, right? That was very big in a lot of the colonies during the American Revolution, right? So this sort of religious take on things, right? So I think we have some examples here of how people can see what's happening and they're looking at the character of people, and it's not what they decide rationally, right? Like St. Paul tells us, I have one law in my mind and another law in my limbs, right? There are things we want to do, we know we should do, but we just don't seem to get around to ever doing them, right? Not on a consistent basis, right? This is as true of societies and nations as it is of individuals, right? So you have to see, what are people capable of? Like, if we want to reform the American government to get back more towards federalism, towards the separation of powers, towards the traditional understanding of liberty, how would we do that, right? One aspect is that all founding fathers would agree is virtue must be recovered before liberty can be recovered, right? So I hear a lot of conservatives and libertarians talk about bringing back liberty, okay? How are you going to bring back the virtue before you can bring back the liberty, which is certainly what any founding father would say would be necessary? How are you going to actually radically change the public schools, the media, TV, the internet, social media, the universities? Would all have to be teaching and informing people on very different things. How are you going to stop family breakdown? How are you going to do that? What provision of the Constitution is going to enable this, right? It's not possible through any of these traditional methods, right? Which is why I believe America is going to continue to deteriorate for some time to come, right? Sorry. But what happens, these things are cyclical, right? The deterioration will continue until there's some sort of crisis, and then people are going to really rethink things, right? And then things can get better after that, right? But sort of within the current paradigm, without breaking into a different paradigm, a different spiritual and cultural paradigm more than a different rational paradigm, America cannot improve. We're trapped in the current paradigm. We will continue to deteriorate, Donald Trump notwithstanding, right? What do you I mean, I voted for Trump, right? I make no secret of that. But what do you think the founding fathers would say about someone like Donald Trump being president of the United States? Okay, all right.
I got a question for,
We'll do Q&A in a minute. Yeah.
So closing statements.
Oh, you closing also? I don't know. We can skip it.
Okay, straight to questions then.
Yeah, I'll take the questions.
Professor, would you like to say anything?
I'll sit over here.
All right. Sure. Tony, go ahead.
yeah, all right. Okay, so I listened to both of you all, and in my head, what if both of your ideologies don't necessarily clash as much as they complement one another? I can see the spiritual aspect, the cultural aspect, directing society one way to a certain point where then maybe logic kicks in. It's like, oh crap, we've got to do something. Perhaps that's maybe what happened in the past, but I guess when I hear you both debate, I see that your theories are more complementing of each other than clashing with one another. And the other thing is applying it to the here and now. With, for example, I read an article, what's not to say that a specific president couldn't go in through a third term running as vice president, and then the president resigns, and then the vice president then becomes the president. Did the founding fathers envision that this sort of thing would happen, or that people would even entertain the idea of it happening? I don't know. And so that's just my thought after listening to you both. I don't know if that's a question or a statement.
More of a statement. Do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
So I'll use the third term example. So if you haven't heard this, the Constitution says, see, no one should be elected to more than 2 terms in office. All right. So there's long been a theory, it predates Trump, that it'd be possible to get around this. How? Person elected president twice, and then the ticket as a vice president. As soon as the president gets to office, he resigns, and the vice president becomes the president. So technically speaking, the VP was not elected president, he was elevated. And therefore it doesn't violate the terms of the Constitution. All right, so Trump is trolling at this point. He's basically said as much, right? He said the idea is too cute, it's not going to work. For anything else, Trump would have to be second fiddle on a ticket. I just can't see that happening. It would be beneath him to have to debate the VP candidate. Oh my God, I can't see that happening. So, but the bigger point is this. Law is at bottom a partial barrier. And if we ever get to the point where society is willing to accept such a clear workaround of the Constitution, then the Constitution will not save us. Now, I don't believe we're deteriorating. I don't think we're even close to that, even remotely. But what makes the United States, I think, special is that we still have intrinsically this understanding of the rule of law. I don't think we're deteriorating irreparably. I don't think there's a cataclysm ahead of us. I think our greatest days are ahead of us. Maybe more of an optimist, Professor D'Agostino. But I do think the Constitution still serves as the guiding light. No matter who is complaining, saying, you're not following the Constitution, Trump, you're not following the Constitution, Hillary, you're not following the Constitution, whoever it is. And for whatever reason, this document has endured for 237 years, and our declaration for 250 years, and I hope another half century ahead of us.
But has anyone ever pushed it to the limit that we're seeing? Like, I remember Professor Korn had an article come out, I think in the New York Times or something that I read, where he was quoted saying that he's not just pushing the envelope, he's shredding it. And I mean, at least in my lifetime, I have never seen a president before me push the limits of the Constitution to the degree that I'm seeing now. And I just wonder, I wonder if the founding fathers thought that this was I don't know, maybe greater.
Fair point. Maybe another question. Yeah.
Really quickly, you cited to the founding fathers and John Adams as people who took from the Declaration of Independence and took those values and applied it, and that's why we've been so successful. But I would like to offer some pushback that even John Adams, in his private writings where he was celebrating free speech, he would later go on to prosecute seditious speech and
It's true.
and the different rebellions like the Whiskey Rebellion, the Shays Rebellion, the Fries Rebellion, all these different heinous acts where, you said that the guillotine is a pretty rough way to die. Well, dying from tar and feathering is a pretty rough way to die as well.
It's a fair point. So, has anyone seen the Hamilton musical? I love it. It's the best. I know the entire thing by heart. There's one line, I do. There's one line they love best where George Washington's talking to Alexander Hamilton, and they're discussing about needing votes to support the Bank of the United States bill, right? They have to get the Bank of the United States through. And Hamilton's going, I just don't have the votes, right, to get this bill through. And then Washington goes to Hamilton, winning is easy, governing is harder. Winning is easy, governing is harder. So in some sense, Providence led us to independence. It led us having these great charters like the Constitution. But once they're written, people have to implement it. Madison wrote in the Federalist, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. We're not angels. Actually, I once got a baby a onesie that said, I'm an angel, I don't need government, right? That's a picture of Madison. But we are not mortal. So you're right. John Adams favored robust free speech, and then as a president, he favored the Alien Sedition Acts, right? Thomas Jefferson vigorously opposed the Bank of the United States, but when he was president, he didn't really take actions to stop it. Andrew Jackson did, right? We're all hypocrites. When we have power, sometimes we use power in our self-interest. That, I think, is a facet of man. But what's important is we still have the First Amendment enshrined, and we can say, wait a minute, you supported this First Amendment and you're violating it, we're holding you to it. Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal, yet he didn't take action to emancipate his slaves. We can hold him against that. The value of written law is to hold us accountable. If law is not written, there is no accountability.
Can I say a few things in response here? First, I'd like to point out, I don't think Trump has pushed constitutional limits nearly as much as some previous presidents. Lyndon Johnson, FDR, right? Abraham Lincoln, right? We've had several previous presidents who pushed limits far more and far harder than Trump. In fact, I would say that Trump does not push the limits any more than Joe Biden or Barack Obama did, or even maybe George W. Bush in some circumstances, right? Trump is just much more obnoxious and colorful about it, right? And again, it's a cultural thing. The media, sort of the deep state, the establishment. Trump offends them, the things that they care about, more than these other fellows did, right? And so they squawk about it a lot more, but looked at objectively, I
It's
think
the louder noise.
they make a loud noise against Trump because they don't like a lot of the things that he's doing.
And I'm not advocating for either side.
Right, so I'm just pointing out, I think very clearly, there have been previous presidents, maybe FDR is the most incontrovertible example that have pushed the constitutional limits and exceeded the limits much more, right? Also say, okay, so we've had the Constitution, the longest serving Constitution ever. Well, is that really true? I mean, in some sort of a technical sense it is, right? But first of all, it's been amended 20-something times, right? So part of the genius of the founders was allowing for the amendment process, but the document is very different than it was when they first wrote and ratified it. It's very different in some very fundamental ways. The new text that's been added or changed is radically different. So we could call it the same Constitution, but is it really, right? That's one thing. A second thing is, part of the genius of the Constitution was that it was written in a way to conform to where America was and where America was going at the time, instead of trying to change America in a way that just wasn't natural, the way the French Revolution tried to do things. And so a lot of the provisions of the Constitution are very vague, which means they can be interpreted very differently over time. So the words stay the same, but as a reality, the Constitution changes radically. So to call it the same Constitution over time, I think is very deceptive. And then, of course, further, I think that the plain language of the Constitution has often been violated over the decades, as we very much speak, we have the same Constitution. Only in some technical, formal sense. We don't have anything close to the same Constitution the Founding Fathers wrote and ratified. We don't have anything close to the same Constitution that we had even just 100 years ago. I think it's radically different now. There's just like an official idea, it hasn't changed. And then people who are obsessed with words on a page might think that, although again, we have the amendment process. But I don't think that's an accurate way of looking at it. I think if we have it radically, I think the Constitution has changed radically over the past 250 years. And I would like to point out too, because Professor Blackman, opened the door to this, I think, we can see the founding fathers themselves violating the Constitution, right? People don't believe in it. People believe in it until they don't, right? So John Adams, Congress passed and John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? And the First Amendment had been ratified years earlier. Now, Adams later regretted it, but he did it, right? As for Thomas Jefferson, he didn't do anything about the bank. Also, Thomas Jefferson railed in favor of strict construction of the Constitution, right? He was very angry the Federalists didn't follow strict construction. Then he became president and he did the Louisiana Purchase, even though he himself admitted it did not conform to strict construction of the Constitution. The Constitution did not authorize the federal government to purchase land. He did it anyway, because he wanted that land. Remember the land thing I was talking about earlier? He and the United States of America wanted that land, and they bought it from the Board, right, when they had the chance. What the Constitution authorized or didn't authorize, forget it, who cares? We want the land and we're getting it, right? So the people who stand on the principle of originalism, whether it's Justice Scalia, whether it's Thomas Jefferson, whether it's John Adams, when the crisis comes and something really important to them comes along, so much for the Constitution. They don't care.
Very good. Another question? No?
I think we're set to go. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you so much.
Give a round of applause for our speakers.